Hello and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Green Alliance event exploring the case for an expanded right to roam. Hopefully, who was in the chat saying that you couldn't get any sound? Kira, you are now. Excellent. That's good news. We were being silent, but now I get to chat. I'm Marianne O'Hotter. I'll be chairing this hour's session, and shortly I'll be introducing our three panelists. The aim of the event the Green Alliance has brought us together for this afternoon is to look at the case for an expanded right to roam. What does improved access to green space look like, specifically in England? What sort of benefits would this bring for physical and mental well-being? How would it inform, help and enrich local communities and economies? What kind of impact would it have on the quality of life of urban dwellers and country dwellers? The event has been scheduled to mark 91 years of the Kinder Mass Trespass, to the very day, in fact. And I think we're probably all aware, the fact that you're here now, you know that this is a heated debate, a contentious debate. There are many different perspectives. And what my aim for this session will be is to bring in those conversations, those thoughts, those perspectives in a positive, collaborative and positively challenging way, because there aren't any easy answers here, I don't think. So to join me in discussing these issues, we have Tompion Platt from the Ramblers. He's the Director of Operations and Advocacy. The Ramblers directly support a community of over 200,000 walkers, plus millions of more peripherally, to access the outdoors and enjoy the benefits of walking. They're currently campaigning for a more equal freedom to roam closer to where people live. Tom himself grew up in the Peak District, where he developed a love of walking and the countryside, and he's currently a council member for the National Trust. We'll also be joined by Soraya Abdelhadi from All the Elements. She's an award-winning writer, artist, sustainability specialist, and the founder of All the Elements CIC, which is a non-profit network for leaders increasing diversity in the UK outdoors. And our third panelist is Kevin Bishop. He's the Chief Executive of the Dartmoor National Park Authority. Previous posts have included being the Director of Environment and Regeneration at the Welsh Local Government Association, the Head of Environment and Countryside Planning at Cardiff University, and he's currently a member of the World Commission on Protected Areas and was previously a council member for the Countryside Council for Wales, the RSPB Committee for Wales, and he's acted as an advisor to the Heritage Lottery Fund. We can only have three panelists, and I think what we've got here is three wise, thoughtful people who can respond to the questions that you may choose to throw at them. So most of us, I think, are now familiar with the format of Zoom webinar, but just in case you're not, the chat will be open. That's going to be pretty much between you attendees. But if you want us to see a question, if you want me to see a question that I might ask to the panelists, then have a look and find the Q&A tab icon at the bottom of your screen and type in your question there. It is visible to everyone, and those are going to be the source of the questions, because I might not be able to keep an eye on and not miss anything that's in the chat. So if you want to ask a question of the panelists, please do put it into the Q&A. But I anticipate that the chat function itself will also be used to have all those interesting and fascinating and immediate side conversations as well. So the structure of the hour that we have together will be that in a minute I'm going to shut up. We're going to hear some opening remarks from Tom. He's going to talk about why the next government ought to prioritise an expanded right to roam. Then we'll hear from Soraya. She's going to be talking about the breadth of the community who are impacted by the issues that we'll be discussing today. And finally, we'll hear from Kevin. He's going to offer his perspectives as one of the custodians of our national parks. The Dartmoor National Park receives 3 million visitors, more than 3 million visitors a year. And Kevin is well placed to know the challenges of balancing rights, responsibilities, and respect for access to the countryside. What we'll then have is about 20 minutes of a discussion between the panelists where I'll raise some of the questions. How will an expanded access initiative make us happier and healthier? Are there inevitable trade-offs? What should access in England look like? Should we follow the Scottish model of the Land Reform Act? Should we have incremental expansion of the Crow Act? Should there be a third alternative? And we're going to look at, given that this is a Green Alliance event, we're also going to have a think about how access is embedded in policy making. How do we politics proof the things that we all hold dear? And then there'll be an opportunity for questions from the audience, and then I'll very quickly wrap up. So I think this should be, if this is your lunch hour, I think this should be a very, very fruitful lunch hour. So grab your sarnies, grab a drink, get comfy, and allow me to introduce Tompion Platt from the Ramblers.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mary, and thank you, the Green Alliance, for hosting this event and inviting me to come along. So starting off with the reason why the Ramblers are campaigning for extended right to roam. And really that's so millions more people can enjoy access to open countryside close to where they live and enjoy those benefits. And as a charity, we've been campaigning for the right to roam for decades. And that campaigning culminated in 2000 with the Countryside and Rights of Way Act, which enabled people and gave people the right to walk off path in certain landscapes. And these rights have been now in place for 20 years, and they've been with very little problems, despite a lot of the opposition at the time and some of the concerns that those access rights would create with things like property values, impacts on agriculture and wildlife and the like. And they were in fact extended to the English coast path as part of the Marine and Coastal Access Act in 2009, enabling people access to beaches and headlands and foreshores. And the English coast path, as many will know, is due to be completed next year, giving people those access rights. But despite those successes, the fact still remains that access to nature is still a major issue, and open access land only covers about 8% of England. And many of those sites of open access land are fairly remote and hard to reach. And the spread of open access land is incredibly unequal, with places like Kent, less than 1% of Kent being open access land, compared to somewhere like the Peak District, where 72% of the land is open access land. So that means that there's a bit of a postcode lottery at the moment in terms of how easy it is for you to access open access land, depending on where you live or whether you can afford to travel to and access it. So put simply, what we're calling for is for an expansion of that right to more landscapes in places such as woodlands, riversides, water edges, and more of the downland, and particularly locations close to urban areas where people can benefit from it. So in terms of why should the government care about and focus on access and the right to roam? Well, I think there's three things broadly that I would like to pick on, and I'm sure people in this room will be familiar with them. Firstly, we know that spending time in nature is good for our health and well-being, and the evidence around that really is irrefutable now. And we've seen how obesity, anxiety, depression, heart disease, all these issues are on the rise. And we strongly believe that it's therefore a health imperative that we enable more people to access and benefit from nature as part of their daily lives. The second reason I would give is that we're living in a nature crisis, but we're also living in a connection with nature crisis. A recent study of European countries found that Britain ranked at the bottom of 14 European countries in terms of nature connectedness. And so our approach to the nature crisis, I strongly believe, is also needs to be tackled an approach to how we connect with nature. And if we do that, we will help foster that sense of care and understanding of the natural world, which has to be part of the solution. And the third reason I would give is that access to nature is a social justice issue. We know there are really significant inequalities of access to nature, and we saw those particularly starkly as part of the COVID lockdowns, where certain people had access to gardens or the countryside or high quality parks, and others absolutely didn't. So whilst the availability of open access land is not the only barrier, of course, to people accessing and feeling comfortable in the countryside, we do think bringing more open access closer to where people live would have major benefits and enable more people to enjoy those benefits. So that's why we believe access and the right to roam is important, and really looking forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you very much, Tom. A lot to think about and discuss already. Next up, Soraya Abdelhadi. Thanks, Soraya.
Hi, everyone. My name is Soraya, and I run All the Elements, which I'll just tell you a little bit about to put it all in context. All the Elements is a non-profit network for everyone creating change on diversity in the UK outdoors. We work across all different diversity areas, so that might be invisible and visible disabilities, gender identity and sexuality, limited financial means, ethnicity, religion, age, body type, basically anything that you can think of that's underrepresented within outdoor spaces. Our community are working on it, and it's growing all the time, and they are doing amazing projects. So they might be researchers, or they might be running community groups, or they might be outdoor instructors. They might work in national parks or in outdoor media organizations. So we have a real breadth of people. And I guess my brief here was to talk about the breadth of people impacted by Right to Roam. And actually, I think Tom's just done a really good job, so I'll try not to cover most of what he's just said. Essentially, it impacts everybody. And I think when I talk about diversity in the outdoors, you can hear that it covers everybody. And I think when we look at representation within outdoor spaces right now, it's not representative of UK society. And we really need to start asking ourselves why that is. What are those barriers? So our community works on representation, which we're not going to talk so much about today, and access. So barriers intersect with this right to roam. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. So if we're talking about limited financial means and being able to get to these spaces, can you afford public transport? Do you have a car? And then you talk about distance. A lot of people in cities don't need a car. They might be able to afford one, but they don't need one. So are they going to have one of those? Is the transport that is being used accessible? Is there enough time in people's lives to be able to travel out to these remote spaces? So we really need to start asking questions around how are we going to make our open spaces more accessible to more people so they can access all the benefits that Tom was talking about earlier, which I think are obvious and I think we all agree on. I'm not going to talk any more about that because I'm really excited to get into the conversation once Kevin has talked a little bit about his work. So I will leave it there.
Great, thank you, Soraya. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. National parks and access go hand in hand, but our national parks are about more than just access. They're also about conservation of the special qualities of nature, the archaeology, the cultural heritage, and they're also about local communities. So for Dartmoor, 34,000 people who live in the national park. And our role as the National Park Authority is to try and balance those different elements, access with conservation, with the well-being of our local communities. And to try and put things into perspective, the 10 national parks in England host 90 million visits per annum. That's 3 times more people visiting our national parks than attending Premier League football matches, Championship football matches, League One and League Two football matches per annum. We are the biggest free to enjoy opportunities open to the British public. The seminar today was talking about expanding the right to roam. I actually think the conversation needs to be about the 3 R's, not just rights, but also responsibilities and respect. So let me pick up on those 3 R's. So in terms of rights, the Dartmoor Commons Act got royal assent in 1985. It was groundbreaking in that it established a right of access to the commons of Dartmoor on foot and on horseback for the purposes of open air recreation. It also established obligations or responsibilities for the National Park Authority to manage that access. without giving us many powers. So rights isn't just about those who want to gain access. We also need to recognise that rights is about the rights of private landowners. It's also about the rights of local communities to be able to enjoy their neighbourhoods as well and not be impacted significantly by visitors. It's also about not just a right to roam, but a right to experience. And I think Tom's alluded to that in terms of, if people go walking in our national parks, we want them to be able to experience nature, the heritage of those places. Turning then to responsibility. And I think that goes hand in hand with rights. Too often, people forget their responsibility. The Countryside Code, my personal belief is that it's sunk without trace. I'm glad that Natural England are looking at relaunching it and giving it new vigour. The Natural History GCSE needs to include material about responsibility, what to do when you're in the countryside. The fact that ours is a working, living landscape, not a wild place. And responsibility goes to the heart of visitor management. Those 90 million visitors to our national parks are welcome, but they create pressures. And we also have a responsibility to all of those people who don't currently visit our national park to try and provide opportunities for them to reach out to all parts of society and give them the same opportunities that those existing visitors have. And we're trying to do that in a small way through things like our NUTS programme. NUTS stands for Night Under the Stars, providing people from different parts of society with an opportunity to spend a night under the stars on Dartmoor, from disadvantaged young people to carers to others. And that's our way of trying to work with private landowners, farmers, to give all parts of society the experience of the wonders of our national park. And respect, the third of my R's. Respect is for all parts of society. And I think at the moment, the vast majority of visitors to our national parks show that respect, but there is a small and perhaps growing minority that don't accept any form of responsibility and show very little respect. I never thought that I would have to put body cameras on our rangers, but we've done that. We're having to do patrols with the police. We employ national park marshals to supplement our rangers in the summer, because too often people turn around, show no respect, have no feeling for responsibility, and we just get antisocial behaviour. And that then gives rights of access a bad press, and you can fully understand why private landowners are concerned about having to clear up the mess left by others. So for me, rights, responsibility and respect need to be three parts of the equation. And where I'm concerned at the moment is that a discussion purely about rights does not reflect where we need to be. Rights, yes, but we also need a responsibility and we need some respect. And the other R, which I haven't mentioned, is resources. Somehow or other, we have to provide resources to help with visitor management. And for national parks, our core budgets have been cut by 50% in the last 10 plus years. So resources are tight. Hopefully I've provided a bit of a flavour of the role of national parks and what I think needs to happen going forward. Marianne, thank you.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Stay in vision. Soraya and Tom, come on in and join us. Cameras off, mics are live. Okay, thank you. Well, let's start then with, does it all come down to money? Tom? Resolving these issues?
No, I don't think it all comes down to money, but money's obviously always important. But the issues, I guess the question is around access more generally, which is a bigger topic, and there's all sorts of barriers that people face to accessing the outdoors. But if we're talking about the right to roam and extending that, no, I don't think that does come down to money ultimately. But I think Kevin's absolutely right. When we talk about rights, we also need to talk about respect and responsibility, and that's something we do always try and do when we're talking about the right to roam. It's really important that any rights have sensible exceptions, and that they go hand in hand with responsibilities that people know about, and to the ecology and to the local community. And I think what we've seen through the last 20 years of the right to roam in England on those landscapes is that a lot of the fears that were presented at the time haven't actually happened, and most of those things can be managed if they're done in the right way. And there are ways and rules and expectations and things like the Countryside Code that can help guide people to act in a responsible way. That's not to say it isn't a problem, and I know some of the problems that Kevin's referring to, and I've heard those, but I think the vast majority of people, as Kevin said, do want to act responsibly. And the more that people know and experience and learn about the outdoors and nature, the more likely they are to respect and look after it and be custodians for it.
The Country Land and Business Association, the CLA, published a briefing in March this year, and in it they say that this kind of campaign that is galvanizing support is wrongly described as the right to roam. People don't have a right to roam, and by describing it as such makes people think that they do have a right to wander wherever they like and do whatever they want, and trespass isn't an issue. And they kind of in this document say, you know, we're talking about littering, we're talking about noise, we're talking about dealing with human waste, but we're also talking about and concede that that's an ill-behaved minority. One of the things that really struck me was the argument that the expanding access to roam over wider areas of the farmed and managed landscape of England will have a cumulative impact on nature recovery and sensitive habitats, as well as an impact on the people who manage and work in the countryside, because you don't know where people are going to be when you're dealing with big farm machinery or turning livestock out or what have you. Now, of course, when you compare it to Scotland, people say, oh, there aren't very many people in Scotland. Of course, it's fine to kind of wander around, you know, Glen Nevis, or maybe Glen Nevis is a bad example. That's quite busy. You know, Assynt, there aren't many people there. You're not going to get squashed by a combine harvester. Sure. But the majority of people in Scotland live in the central belt, where lowland access is still encapsulated in the Land Reform Act. So you can walk along field margins, you can't trample crops, you can't go into yards and kind of gardens. Kevin, would you say that there always is that balance between there has to be a kind of a trade-off between nature recovery, protecting habitats for nature to have freedom to restore, versus allowing people access to go for a picnic, go for a mountain bike ride, particularly perhaps walk their dog? Dogs are an issue, aren't they?
Dogs are an issue, but well-behaved dogs and responsible dog owners are the answer to the dog issue, aren't they? But let's not focus on dogs. For me, I think we can learn from the Scottish experience, but we need to reflect the fact that England is different and Wales is different as well. For us, I think what we're after is a right to experience, not just a right to roam per se. So a right to roam is limited. What you need is the ability to experience nature. How can we get nature recovery in this country if people can't experience and enjoy nature? We also need to reflect the fact that we walk in the footsteps of our forefathers. You know, Dartmoor, particularly important for the Bronze Age landscape, you will trip over hut circles, reeves, and so forth if you go for a walk on Dartmoor. But how many people recognise those as such? So for me, key to all of this is engendering that sense of wonderment that's based on responsibility and respect. You know, when you're going, you want to be out for a walk. You want to be able to hear the skylarks, the curlews, the lapwing. You want people to keep their dog on a lead during ground nest birding season, and so forth. You only get that, I think, through a mass movement of society, i.e. people are taught this at an early age, and it's not just taught through schools. We want everybody to be able to experience our national parks, and it's that practical experience, you know, of walking in our national park, camping, or experiencing a national park that I think engenders that sense of responsibility. So learn from Scotland, Yes, money, going back to your question to Tom, money is important, but it's not the only factor in all of this, is it? You know, some of us are old enough to remember the Clunk Click campaign that got us all to wear seatbelts. You need something like that for the Countryside Code that captures people's imagination. And probably the best way in which you can help police this with a small p is other visitors, other walkers, reminding people perhaps to keep their dogs on lead during bird nesting season, picking up litter if they've inadvertently dropped it, or reminding people not to have an open fire, you know, in particular areas, because our rangers we'll never have the right number of rangers to be in all of the places all of the times. So for me, enjoyment, experience, but also the responsibility.
I worry, Kevin, though, whether sometimes that policing of outdoor spaces by outdoor users can engender quite harmful prejudice that might be sitting as an undercurrent around this conversation. I've certainly heard very passionate and enthusiastic outdoor users talking about the new people to the countryside, new visitors, and it's sort of encaptured in that description comes a lot of unspoken prejudice. I was struck, the Right to Roam campaign put out a briefing document that as a hill walking ambassador for the British Mountaineering Council, I read, and I'm going to quote from them, and then I'd like your responses and from you as well, perhaps, Soraya. Okay, so the Right to Roam campaign say, we should not concede the view that there is anything inherently wrong with more people in the countryside. Such arguments are often rooted in prejudices about urban demographics and the wrong sort of people being in the countryside. They belong to a long history of anti-democratic thinking about the countryside, who has a right to be in it and what sort of recreation is acceptable. These are often more a reflection of entitled attitudes derived from England's long unequal legacy of land ownership, with an estimated 1% of landowners still controlling 50% of all land, than any genuine harm resulting from the presence of people. True harm can be mitigated. Kevin, what are your thoughts?
We want our national parks to be enjoyed by all parts of society. There isn't a wrong sort of person, but there is a wrong sort of behaviour, and that behaviour pattern can be from all types of people and visitor. But stopping particular parts of society or the wrong sort of person from visiting national parks is not what we're about. We want to embrace all types of visitor.
I'm sure you're not, but do you recognise that? Do you recognise that kind of undercurrent in conversations? I mean, you have conversations with lots of people from all sides of this debate, don't you?
I think the tension is there between, if you like, local communities being fearful of being swamped by large numbers of visitors. I think there's a fear from private landowners that their rights will be impacted by new rights to roam. I think there's a fear factor there, but the fear is around actually the volume or the type of activity. I'm not convinced it's about wrong people.
Okay.
And certainly we would want no part of that conversation. We're working hard to try and make sure we open our national parks to all parts of society, because we recognise, being perfectly candid, it's probably people like myself that enjoy our national parks the most. ABC ones, white, middle class, affluent people. They need to be for all. Lewis Silkin, when he passed the bill into Parliament that led to our national parks, spoke about it being a people's charter. Our challenge is to reinvent that people's charter for the 21st century.
Soraya, what are your thoughts on this aspect before we move on?
I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on this, as I think most people would expect. I think we're spending a lot of time talking about controls. That's what it feels like. The default is the wrong way round, because if these spaces, well, we are all part of nature, right? And so we've arbitrarily put in boundaries and places where we're saying people can and can't go. And by doing that, we've actually put a whole segment, a huge segment of society that can't access these outside spaces. So to me, the default should be a right to these open spaces, particularly open spaces that are nearer the communities that can't get access to them. And right now we're talking about speculative, you know, if we do take down these barriers, and as I said, the barriers are complex. So it's not even as easy as, hey, we put in a right to roam and suddenly the countryside is going to be swamped with people. That's not how it's going to work, because there are still a lot of different barriers that need to be taken down in order for people to be able to access the spaces. This is one part of it, but we need to start with that as the default and then work backwards, because right now you're talking about impacts that you don't even know if they're going to happen. We're talking about people who live in UK society and understand normal UK society rules. If we're talking about things like litter, if we're talking about things like dog behavior. So I think, yeah, I just feel like this conversation has become very much about how do we control people? And I think it should be more about how do we help people to get outside more.
Okay, lovely. Let's just move on for a moment and say the benefit of access to outdoor and green and blue spaces is, I think, unequivocal. Tom, you referenced that in your opening remarks. The government themselves have committed in the new environmental improvement plan to every household in England being within 15 minutes of green space or water that's accessible. However, it's a bit absent in the new ELMS proposals, isn't it? If we are thinking about an expanded right to roam in England, I'm going to come to you first, Tom. Should we be thinking about a model that follows the Scottish Land Reform Act, where, as Soraya says, it's pretty much access except by exception? Or should we be looking at an incremental increase in the Countryside and Rights of Way Act? If we do that, and this is one of the questions that's come up in the webinar Q&A a couple of times, how do we avoid a multiple series of issues about very prolonged and very tumultuous mapping exercises that will be expensive and time consuming? How do we end up without access islands and left with putting in new paths to reach these designated zones? How do we define what counts as open or access land? You know, what counts as a woodland? Is an area that's about to be forested, does that count, or does it have to be ancient woodland? It kind of gets messy when we're kind of aiming for incremental change, but equally it gets potentially for some members of the debate here, not this debate but the broader debate, it could be quite scary to think, well, you know, let's chuck it all in and then see where the problems are and we'll deal with those as we get to them. Tom, what would you firstly, what kind of where how did the Ramblers reach the Freedom to Roam campaign that you're going for, and what does that constitute as well? Tell us more.
Yeah, really good question, Mary, and you can imagine it's something we've tackled and talked about a lot. And in Scotland, we were very involved in the Land Reform Act, campaigning for that and the development of the code up there and the Scottish Access Framework. And we spend an awful lot of time, the team there, protecting and championing those brilliant access rights. I think the situation we have in England is we've got the Countryside and Rights of Way Act. It's been in place for 20 years. There was a lot of debate at the time to get that through. It's worked relatively, I'd say, very well. We've since seen it expand to the English Coast Path, and that's demonstrated and provided people access to coastal areas and the uplands, and the coastline. So really, kind of the view that we have is that the best model for in England's situation is to expand that model, because we think that's the model that is most likely to succeed and cut through and bring those benefits to many people.
Now,
so
do you say
absolutely understand the. Oh, sorry. No, you go.
No, go on.
No, I was just saying, I absolutely understand the pros and cons of Scotland, and I absolutely understand why people would be calling for those. But you know, I think any system, trying to bring in a Scottish style access reform would also take a number of years and would no doubt come up with huge amounts of opposition too from lots of the kind of people we've already talked about, some of the landowners, etc. So there's not one easy solution, but we believe the best solution for the context is to extend the current mapping system.
Now, is that because a sort of a bit more of a pragmatic approach, given politics, given land ownership and kind of the legacy of land inequality in England? Or if I could give you a magic wand and you could wave it, would you go for incremental expansion of Crow, or would you go for something more radical?
I don't think one's about being more radical than the others. But I do think it's about practicalities, and we've got something in England that has worked really well. And we just think that that's the most likely way that we're going to extend those rights to reach more people. And there are problems in the Scotland context too. One of the issues we have in Scotland is the public rights of way is not protected nearly so much, and we've got real problems there with the public rights of way being damaged by development and all sorts of other things, which means that lots of people will have to really fight there now for a better path network there, because a lot of people do like to walk off path, but the vast majority of people actually like to have a path, have signage, know where they're going and follow those path networks. So there are pros and cons of different approaches. And as I said, we're very proud of the access rights in Scotland, but we think the right approach in England at this time is around extending the current Crow mapping approach.
Soraya, have you canvassed the leaders in all the elements in the network? Where do people stand on this? What do people want?
People want access to more open spaces for their communities and the people they represent. That's the essence of it. I think it's very easy for people who have always had access to countryside and open spaces and green spaces and nature and had that knowledge embedded in them from a young age to feel protective about the way that they personally experience the outdoors, and they want everyone else to experience it in the same way that they do. I think we talked a little bit about how people are perceived going into these spaces, and I know that the community groups that I represent have experienced pushback and stereotyping and people believing that them being in those spaces is a negative thing and is something that they don't want to see more of. So yeah, we need more access. Who has the right, due to mostly an accident of birth, to be able to say, hey, this space is ours. Some of you can come, but only under these particular conditions. It just doesn't make any sense.
Kevin, do you support an extended right to roam? What would it look like? Either personally or speaking on behalf of the Dartmoor National Park, or perhaps, I don't know, maybe you've been mandated. You can tell us what the collective of national parks think about this.
Sorry to let you down, I haven't been mandated. So, I think for me, it's what do we mean by that phrase, right to roam? It has so many different meanings to so many different people. So
okay, let's be specific
really
then. An extension of the Crow Act as it stands, or a Land Reform Act style opening of access to all open land?
So you've talked about a magic wand, haven't you? So for me, if you gave me the magic wand, I'd have a number of priorities. I think the first would be investment in our current access infrastructure to make sure it's fit for purpose. So I think we're seeing a decline in the quality of our public rights of way. We need to address that because, as Tom said, the majority of people want certainty. And certainty is a footpath that they can follow. They also want the opportunity to be able to walk in circular routes and so forth, either from a car or from home or from a bus stop and so forth. So we need to connect missing connections. I think then there's also a priority around opportunities for all to enjoy. So that's making sure that we remove some of the barriers to access, and that might be access to public transport. It might be the so-called Gore-Tex factor. People thinking they can't go for a walk because they haven't got the right kit. We're doing some work with that, donating boots through Dartmoor Preservation Association and so forth. So that. And I'd also have a bit more of a focus on stepping stones. So I think it's Soraya's point about local space, really important. We did some work a few years back with Plymouth, access to sort of local space, country parks, and then out into the national park. So it's all of that, I think, is really important. And to me, it's actually getting clarity on what do we mean by the right to roam. And I think that's an emphasis then on organisations like the Ramblers and the Right to Roam groups to be very clear about what they're asking for. And as I said, to me, the right is not just to roam, is also the responsibility that comes with it.
What would your thoughts be? Would you be supportive of extending open access to areas that aren't the Dartmoor Commons, but are the farmed areas of Devon and Dorset, Cornwall, your patch, the southwest?
So my priority would be not extending those rights, but actually ensuring that the public rights of way network that we currently have is open for all to use. And I'd rather see money and time spent on that than extending new rights of access at this point in time, because I think that best fits society, and making sure that we have the ability to easily fill in the gaps where you could link rights of way to create circular routes or to fit desire lines. And then you move from that into a right to roam.
Does that bring us back to that question of, is this actually about money? Is it, you know, investment in the Countryside Code, investment in opportunities for people to experience wild spaces and open places? Is it about investment to support landowners and local authorities to maintain and improve the network of paths that they already have? For you, perhaps, to have a ranger service like the Glover report recommended?
Well, we
just need more money.
New rangers that Julian Glover referred to. Yeah, money has a key role to play, doesn't it? So, and the money is to provide opportunities for management to make sure all parts of society can access the countryside. It's about promoting the Countryside Code, as I referred to. It's also about perhaps helping through the new Elm scheme, payments for land managers, landowners, to tackle visitor management, not necessarily paying for things that we think should be a right, but perhaps helping with interpretation, helping with education, helping with cleanup.
How much is it, and very shortly, folks in the audience, I'm going to come to, I've been kind of throwing in some of the questions, but I'm going to be more explicit in asking some of your questions to the panelists. If you go to the Q&A function, you can also upvote questions. So if you've seen one that you're like, yes, Marianne needs to ask that question, then there's a little thumbs up icon. If you click on that, then I can see that lots of people are keen on that question being asked. So and if you do have other questions, again, let me remind you, don't put them in the chat because I'm not reading that. Put them in the Q&A for me, please. Thank you very much indeed. I've forgotten what I was going to say now. I've distracted myself. No, it's totally gone. It's a good start, man. Yeah, go.
Yeah, I was just going to say something on the money question, which obviously is an important factor that we do need to consider. But I think we need to think about what is it that we want and get everybody on board, and then work out the money side, because the money exists in this world to do these things. It does. I know it's hard. I mean, I run a nonprofit myself. I know it's incredibly hard, but the money is out there. I think we need to look at what do we need first, and then look at, you know, how are we going to pay for it? Because if we start from how are we going to get the money, then we're just never going to do anything.
You've helped me there, Soraya, because you've also reminded me of the question that I was going to throw your way, which is, so it might not just be about money then. Is it more about a fundamental cultural shift, sort of challenging the idea of, well, whose land is it anyway?
Yes, in simple terms, absolutely. I think it is really important that people start to realize how privileged they are to have access and ownership of these spaces. And we need to take a bit more of an approach where we look at it and we say, okay, this person has this much land, like these large landowners, you have this much land. Actually, what more can you do to allow people to access this? I know Right to Roam's been talking a lot about green belt land, which is land which is going to be closer to a lot of these communities that can't access these outside spaces. What does that look like? How do we make that happen? Yeah, so that's it.
That brings us nicely, panelists, to questions from the audience. Daniel C says, is there a danger that we're getting bogged down in debates of incremental versus a Scottish system, when the actual bigger challenge is that there remains a lot of people we need to be persuaded that this is, oh, hang on, where's he gone? Oh, you've answered it already. Hang on, I was reading it. The bigger challenge is that there remains a lot of people we need to be persuaded to accept the basic principle of greater access in the first place. Tom, would you say that that's the case? That people need to be kind of convinced of that this is a responsibility of having the privilege of owning or managing land?
I think that's part of the case. I don't think it's the biggest challenge, actually. I mean, I think when we've the research, when we've spoken to members of the public and done opinion polls, actually there's a broad support that people should have broader access to the countryside. And despite the Dartmoor case, the legal case being awful in the decision that was made, what was really encouraging, I thought, from that was the public backlash people saw when they realized their rights were under threat, and the groups like the Right to Roam campaign and Stars for Everyone and all those groups who have raised the profile of this and the public interest in the right to roam, I think has shown there's a real public support and demand. So I think most of the public don't really understand their rights, and that's a big challenge. And Kevin's talked about education and countryside code and younger people. I think that's absolutely right. People don't understand where they can walk and where they can't walk and what they should do. I think that's a bigger part of the challenge, but the only way we're really going to solve that is by enabling more people to access the outdoors and giving those rights and educating those responsibilities. And so I think that's more the solution, rather than worrying about, is this about convincing the landowners? Although obviously we need to make the case. And what's also been very promising recently is there seems to be a wider political consensus that expanding the right to roam is something that we should be doing, and has all those benefits that I outlined right at the start of the conversation.
Well, of course,
I have a question to follow up from that, just to jump in terms of the people who you were talking about surveying and saying that they were for access. Do you know how many of those were landowners? Because I think the general public as a whole, if you say to them, do you want good things for good people, will say yes, right? But we're talking about like actual change, like people who could actually make the decisions to create change. So I'm just wondering if there was a way of splitting that out.
I honestly don't know our split for landowners. I don't think we probably know the exact area of land that they each had, but I think there are some really good landowners who are trying to improve access to the outdoors, and there's probably others that have more reservations about it, and some of those reservations will be based on personal experiences, which we can understand. There was an interesting Natural England study a couple of years ago that found that landowners who experienced more people on their land, lived close to urban areas and more used to dealing with people on their land, actually were more comfortable with it because they're used to it and they experienced it and they knew how to deal with it and they managed it. And those who had less people accessing the land had more inhibitions about it, because I guess they experienced it less, and then when it happened, they feared what I guess they didn't understand. So I think it's a complex one. I don't think it's all landowners against this, and I think there's some really good things happening. And many of these debates were had 20 years ago, and the fears have not been realised. And I think if we were to extend the right to roam, which I hope we will, to woodlands and riversides, we'd see that in a few years, everyone would be fighting to keep those rights.
I think that's an important point, isn't it, Tom? That now, if you look at the network of landowners, land managers, and advocates and campaigners for public access to the outdoors in Scotland, you see a lot of collaboration, and it's not without its problems, it's not without its challenges. Of course, the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park, which is close to large areas of urban population, have had to contend with the challenges of dealing with heavy visitor numbers in landscapes that can only deal with a certain amount of footfall, all the rest of it. Kevin, do you think that would happen? Do you think there's a political appetite? Actually, hang on, I'm going to add in an extra question from the audience. Peter Judd from the British Mountaineering Council says, some of the benefits suggested as outcomes of more access are only apparent in the long term, for example, savings to the NHS or health benefits. Politicians are motivated by short-term gains that fit the length of the electoral cycle. What short-term gains occur to, I'll start with you, Kevin, but occur broadly to the panel, that could be suggested to incentivize politicians to make access gains be a priority. I mean, as we're moving closer towards a potential general election, I do wonder whether this will become a more tribal, more polarized issue where party politics split down lines of class politics and ethnicity, and the kind of the rural fearful and the urban masses, to be crude.
Do you want me to have a go answering that first, Marianne?
Yeah, go for it.
I would hope that politicians of all colours and all persuasions would see the benefits of access to the countryside for all, because they are clear, aren't they? And we've got a ticking time bomb in this country in terms of the obesity challenge. We've got a growing mental health challenge as well. Those of us lucky enough to go for a walk in the countryside know full well that those self-prescribers, if I can put it that way, are already helping the NHS. As long as you don't go and break your leg whilst you're doing your walk, you are easing the pressure on the NHS service. And if you are then visiting a local pub and not taking too much alcohol or eating the right sort of food, you're leaving a benefit in the local community. Access to the countryside needs to be seen in the round. You are creating a better society. You are helping communities. You are putting money into local businesses. Why wouldn't you support access to the countryside, especially if you can get people to enjoy themselves responsibly? So I would hope that politicians of all persuasion would support access and do their bit, because it has the Heineken factor. It can reach parts that other initiatives can't. And why pay for a gym subscription if you could access your local green space?
To be crude, though, I mean, one of the reasons that perhaps, this is my interpretation, the reason that England and Wales went for a Crow Act rather than Scottish land reform version 20 years ago was because the House of Lords would absolutely have blocked it, because the House of Lords own half of, or more than half of, England. I mean, am I being too crude that perhaps the Conservative Party, the people who the big ticket donors are the ones who possibly own half of Dorset or Cumbria or wherever? There are vested interests, aren't there?
So the House of Lords can't block, can they? They can amend, they can filibuster and so forth, but they can't formally block. And you're right, it was a Labour government that gave us the right to roam in England, as currently constituted through the Countryside and Rights of Way Act. But the Conservative government have also committed to increased access. You referred to it yourself in the opening comments about their new environmental action programme and so forth, access to green space. So, yeah, yes, there are vested interests in all of this argument, but we need to find our way through that, don't we? And to be fair to the landowners, there are genuine concerns that they've got. If you look at the current debate on Dartmoor, most of the landowners on Dartmoor are not against backpack camping done properly and leave no trace. The concerns are around what we call fly camping, people who camp irresponsibly and leave waste, human excrement, and create problems. We've got common ground with those landowners to tackle those issues. And the issue is, what powers do we have to tackle those issues? And you don't tackle the issues by removing rights.
And does anyone else want to jump in on that, or should I go to the next question?
Mary, I mean, just to say, I think politicians care about votes and public opinion, and that's why it was interesting during the Dartmoor case that did make certain political parties kind of come out and show their colours and support. So I think the more we can show public support and opinion for this and explain these access rights and what they would mean, the benefits they would bring, the better. But there are, we do need to think about how there will be trade-offs in any kind of policy legislation like this. And we saw that in the Crow Act itself, where it put a time limit on the designating historic paths, for example, that we've been struggling with ever since. So, that's part of the process we need to be wary of. But there's absolutely one of the benefits of Crow is that we've got a format that that has been expanded already in some cases, and we believe could be extended in other places too.
So the incentives for politicians are that the public demonstrate that they care about these things, they're willing to make noise around these issues and kind of demand change, would you say? Do we need another mass trespass circa 2023 going into 2024? Do we need a kind of radical action on the land, would you say, Tom? Or is it polite letter writing campaigns and a social media hashtag?
The boring answer to that is it's usually a combination of both. I think there's absolutely space for radical movements and mass trespassers and people putting up banners and standing outside buildings and making the case, and that's absolutely part of demonstrating the public opinion and getting public awareness. And as ever, there's always internal conversations and lobbying and making the case and evidence gathering and research and all those things. So it's never one or the other. And I think what I'm really pleased to be seeing is that there's a growing movement of a wide range of organization and bodies, whether they're representing different people in society or different users, that are now really joining together and pushing for a greater right to roam, which I think is really promising.
And we're coming to the end of our hour. So Soraya, I'm going to throw the final question your way. It's from an anonymous attendee. As a small landowner, it's extremely difficult to allow people access across your land unless legislation makes it easier for landowners. For example, insurance issues, biosecurity, consistent good practice guidelines, etc. are implemented. Who's working on this? I'm not going to ask you who's working on this, but should we be working on this? Should we collectively, as a kind of a unity of different voices, but who are all perhaps pulling in the same direction for greater access for the public to open spaces and natural landscapes, does there need to be as much effort and noise put behind supporting land managers who want to do the right thing as there is about clamoring for the right for more from public and campaign groups?
That is a really interesting question. And absolutely, I mean, I know in my work, we work with a whole range of people to have those conversations. And I think the challenge is, this is funny after just having that money conversation earlier, the challenge is that the people who are available to help because they have the money and the backing and the support behind them are not necessarily the people who are really pushing forward these campaigns. And so, yes, I think we need help. I was talking to somebody about this just the other day, and I was talking about small landowners. My background before I did sustainability and all of these things was in law. I completely understand those responsibilities that landowners face. Even when they're looking at people trespassing, they have a responsibility to make sure that their land is safe if they know people trespass. I think, yes, we need to work together. It's really important that we work together as a community. And I feel like we end up in these conversations where it becomes divisive. And there are amazing landowners. I've had incredible conversations with landowners who do want to open their spaces and do face those barriers. So yes, and I'm more than happy to be part of that group of people. And I know there are loads of people in the community who would too. We just need to work out how to create that capacity within everybody to come together to be able to create that change.
I think that's a lovely point to end on. Kevin and Tom are nodding. Oh, yeah, are you nodding? Okay, I didn't know whether you were smirking or nodding then. You're only a small thumbnail. Okay, well, my clock says 1400 hours, so I'm already overrunning. So I apologise to folks who've finished their sandwiches and probably need to get back to work. I would like to thank Kevin Bishop from the Dartmoor National Park Authority, Tom Platt from the Ramblers, and Soraya Abdul-Hadi from All the Elements. I'm Marianne O'Hotter, and I would also like to thank the Green Alliance for bringing us together for this conversation. If you want to share this webinar with friends, with colleagues, with your network, then it will be shortly uploaded to the Green Alliance YouTube channel. The Green Alliance will also tweet about it on their Twitter account, and they'll be using the hashtag #GA-event. If you want to find out more about the next and upcoming Green Alliance events, webinars, then click on the link that will be sent to you via email, or head over to their website and you can join the newsletter and get up to speed with what they are hosting next. So it saves just me to say thank you all for joining us, and goodbye.